The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Kensington Palace, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the gardens. His small hands were tucked deep into the pockets of his navy blue jacket, and his eyes focused on the gravel path beneath his feet. Today was different from other days, though nobody around him seemed to notice the change in the young prince. George had always been a thoughtful child, preferring to observe rather than speak. While other children his age might run and shout, he moved with a careful grace that reminded palace staff of his great-grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. His teachers often remarked on his ability to listen intently, absorbing every detail of conversations happening around him. On this particular morning, George had overheard something that troubled him deeply. During breakfast, he had been sitting quietly at the dining table when he heard his protection officer, Inspector Matthews, speaking in hushed tones with another guard near the doorway. The conversation was meant to be private, but George's sharp ears caught every word. Inspector Matthews had been with the royal family for 15 years. He was a tall, sturdy man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that had always made George feel safe. The inspector had taught George how to tie proper knots, had shared stories about his own childhood, and had even helped the young prince with his mathematics homework when the royal tutors were busy. But now, George learned that Inspector Matthews was facing a terrible choice. His elderly mother had fallen seriously ill, and the medical bills were mounting higher than his salary could cover. The inspector's voice had cracked slightly as he explained to his colleague that he might need to resign from his position to take a higher-paying job in private security. George knew that Inspector Matthews loved his work protecting the royal family. The man had once told him that serving the crown was the greatest honor of his life. The inspector had no family of his own, having dedicated his entire career to royal protection. His mother was his only living relative, and the thought of losing her was breaking his heart. As George continued his walk through the gardens, he thought about all the times Inspector Matthews had been there for him. When George had been frightened during a thunderstorm, the inspector had sat with him and told him stories until the thunder passed. When George had scraped his knee during a riding lesson, Inspector Matthews had been the first to reach him, carefully cleaning the wound and making sure he was okay. The young prince also remembered the conversations he had overheard between his parents about money and responsibility. Prince William and Catherine often spoke about using their position to help others, about the importance of service and compassion. George had listened as they discussed various charitable causes and the difference they could make in people's lives. Now, George found himself in a position where he could make a real difference for someone who had been so important to him. But he was only 10 years old, and he knew that adults often dismiss children's ideas as naive or impractical. He needed to find a way to help Inspector Matthews without creating a scene or embarrassing anyone. George's mind began to work on a plan. He knew that his great-grandmother had always believed in the power of quiet action. She had taught the family that sometimes the most meaningful gestures were the ones made without fanfare or public attention. The young prince decided that he would follow her example. As he walked back toward the palace, George noticed Inspector Matthews standing at his usual post near the main entrance. The man's shoulders seemed to carry a heavy weight, and his usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by a look of deep worry. George approached slowly, his heart racing as he prepared to put his plan into motion. The inspector smiled when he saw the young prince approaching, though George could see the sadness behind his eyes. They exchanged their usual morning greeting, but George could sense the difference in the man's voice. There was a finality to it, as if Inspector Matthews was already saying goodbye. That evening, George sat in his room, staring out the window at the gardens where he had walked that morning. He had made his decision, and tomorrow he would begin to act on it. He understood that what he was planning might seem small to adults, but he believed that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the biggest impact. George fell asleep that night thinking about Inspector Matthews and his sick mother. He dreamed of his great-grandmother, who seemed to nod approvingly at his plans. In his dream, she reminded him that true royalty was not about crowns or titles, but about using whatever power you had to help others when they needed it most. The next morning would bring the beginning of Prince George's quiet mission, one that would change not only Inspector Matthews's life, but also teach everyone around them about the true meaning of compassion and leadership. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, with autumn leaves dancing in the gentle breeze outside Prince George's bedroom window. The young prince had barely slept, his mind busy with the plan he had been forming throughout the night. He dressed quickly in his school uniform, but instead of heading straight to breakfast, he made a detour to his father's study. Prince William was already at his desk, reviewing papers for his upcoming engagements. He looked up in surprise when George knocked softly on the doorframe. It was unusual for his eldest son to seek him out so early in the morning, especially before breakfast. George entered the study with careful steps, his hands clasped behind his back. He had practiced what he wanted to say, but now that he stood before his father, the words felt heavy on his tongue. Prince William set down his papers and gave his son his full attention, sensing that something important was weighing on the boy's mind. The young prince began by asking his father about the royal household staff, specifically about their families and their lives outside the palace. Prince William was touched by his son's interest in the people who worked for them, though he wondered where these questions were leading. George listened carefully as his father explained how the royal family had always tried to be good employers, providing fair wages and support for their staff. Then George asked about Inspector Matthews. He inquired about the man's years of service, his dedication to protecting the family, and whether his father knew about any challenges the inspector might be facing. Prince William praised Inspector Matthews highly, describing him as one of the most trustworthy and dedicated members of their security team. George nodded thoughtfully, then surprised his father by asking about the royal family's emergency fund for staff members who faced unexpected hardships. Prince William explained that such a fund existed, though it was rarely used and required careful consideration of each case. The fund was designed to help long-serving staff members who found themselves in genuine need through no fault of their own. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with George asking detailed questions about how such assistance would be provided, who would make the decisions, and how the family could help without causing embarrassment to the person in need. Prince William found himself impressed by his son's mature questions and his obvious concern for others. When George finally left his father's study, he felt more confident about his plan. He had learned that the mechanisms existed to help Inspector Matthews, but he also understood that the process needed to be handled delicately. The inspector was a proud man who might not accept charity, even from the royal family he served so loyally. During breakfast, George observed Inspector Matthews more closely than usual. The man stood at his post with perfect posture and professional demeanor, but George could see the tension in his shoulders and the worry lines around his eyes. When their eyes met briefly, George offered a small smile, which Inspector Matthews returned with genuine warmth. After breakfast, George had his usual tutoring session, but he found it difficult to concentrate on mathematics and history when his mind was occupied with more pressing matters. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed his distraction and gently asked if everything was all right. George assured her that he was fine, though he spent much of the lesson thinking about his next steps. During his lunch break, George made another important visit, this time to Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper who had worked for the royal family for over 20 years. Mrs. Patterson had always been kind to George, often sneaking him extra biscuits and listening patiently to his questions about palace life. George asked Mrs. Patterson about Inspector Matthews, curious about what she knew of his personal situation. The housekeeper's face grew serious as she explained that she was aware of the inspector's troubles with his mother's illness. She revealed that several staff members had been quietly discussing ways they might help, perhaps by organizing a collection among themselves. The young prince listened carefully, then asked Mrs. Patterson whether she thought Inspector Matthews would accept help from his colleagues. The housekeeper shook her head sadly, explaining that the inspector was too proud and would likely see such assistance as charity. She mentioned that Inspector Matthews had already begun looking for other employment opportunities that would pay better. George thanked Mrs. Patterson for her honesty and asked her to keep their conversation private for now. The housekeeper agreed, though she wondered what the young prince might be planning. She had watched George grow up and knew that he possessed both intelligence and compassion beyond his years. That afternoon, George took a walk through the palace corridors, observing the various staff members going about their duties. He saw the dedication in their faces, the pride they took in their work, and the genuine care they showed for the royal family. It struck him that these people were not just employees, but an extended family who looked after each other and the royals they served. As the day drew to a close, George felt the weight of responsibility settling on his young shoulders. He knew that tomorrow he would need to take action, but he also understood that whatever he did needed to be done carefully and thoughtfully. Inspector Matthews' dignity was just as important as his financial need, and George was determined to find a way to address both. That evening, as Inspector Matthews walked his final patrol of the day, he noticed Prince George watching him from an upstairs window. The boy raised his hand in a small wave, and Inspector Matthews waved back, unaware that his young charge was working on a plan that would soon change everything for him and his ailing mother. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Kensington Palace. Prince George had woken before dawn, his mind racing with the details of what he planned to do. He had spent the previous evening writing a carefully worded letter, revising it several times until he felt it captured exactly what he wanted to say. After breakfast, George approached his mother, Catherine, in her private sitting room. The Princess of Wales was reviewing her schedule for the week when her eldest son knocked gently on the door. Catherine immediately noticed something different about George's demeanor. There was a seriousness in his expression that reminded her of his grandfather, King Charles, when he was contemplating important decisions. George asked his mother if they could have a private conversation about something that was very important to him. Catherine set aside her papers and gave him her complete attention, sensing that this was no ordinary childhood request. The young prince then did something that surprised her. He handed her a sealed envelope and asked her to read the letter inside. The letter was written in George's careful handwriting, with only a few small corrections visible. In it, he explained that he had become aware of Inspector Matthews' difficult situation and wanted to help. However, George wrote that he understood the inspector would not accept direct charity, so he had devised a different approach. George proposed that Inspector Matthews be given additional responsibilities that would justify a significant salary increase. He suggested that the inspector could become the head of palace security training, teaching new guards and sharing his 15 years of experience with younger officers. This would be a promotion that Inspector Matthews had earned through his years of dedicated service, not a handout. Catherine read the letter twice, amazed by her son's thoughtfulness and maturity. The proposal was not only kind, but also practical and respectful of Inspector Matthews' dignity. She asked George how he had learned about the inspector's situation, and the boy honestly explained about overhearing the conversation between the guards. What impressed Catherine most was that George had not immediately run to his parents asking them to fix the problem. Instead, he had taken time to think through a solution that would benefit everyone involved. The inspector would receive the help he needed while maintaining his pride, and the palace would benefit from his expertise in training new security personnel. Catherine discussed the proposal with George, asking him thoughtful questions about the details and logistics. The young prince had clearly thought through many aspects of his plan, from how the training program could be structured to how Inspector Matthews could balance his new duties with his current responsibilities. After their conversation, Catherine promised George that she would discuss his proposal with Prince William and with the head of palace security. She warned him that these decisions took time and involved many people, but she assured him that his idea would be given serious consideration. Later that morning, Catherine met with Prince William in his study and shared George's letter with him. Prince William read it with growing amazement and pride in his son's compassion and wisdom. They both agreed that the proposal had merit and deserved to be pursued through proper channels. Prince William immediately contacted Sir Robert Harrison, the head of palace security, and requested a meeting to discuss expanding the security training program. He did not initially mention that the idea had come from George, wanting the proposal to be evaluated on its own merits first. Meanwhile, George continued with his normal routine, attending his tutoring sessions and participating in his usual activities. However, his tutors and the palace staff noticed that he seemed more focused and purposeful than usual. There was a quiet confidence about him that had not been there before. During lunch, George made a point of speaking with Inspector Matthews about the inspector's experiences in security work. He asked thoughtful questions about what qualities made a good protection officer, and what advice the inspector would give to someone just starting in security work. Inspector Matthews was pleased by the young prince's interest and shared several stories from his years of service. George listened intently, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in understanding the inspector's expertise. What Inspector Matthews did not realize was that George was gathering information that would support his proposal for the new training program. That afternoon, Sir Robert Harrison met with Prince William to discuss the security training expansion. The head of security was enthusiastic about the idea, noting that they had been considering ways to better train new personnel and retain experienced officers. He immediately suggested that Inspector Matthews would be an ideal candidate to lead such a program. Prince William asked Sir Robert to prepare a formal proposal for the new position, including a salary structure that would reflect the additional responsibilities. He emphasized that the role should be offered to Inspector Matthews as a recognition of his expertise and years of service, not as a favor. As the day ended, George felt a mixture of nervousness and hope. He had set events in motion, but now he had to wait and trust that the adults around him would follow through appropriately. He understood that his part in the plan needed to remain secret, at least for now, to ensure that Inspector Matthews would view any offer as genuine recognition of his abilities. That evening, George looked out his bedroom window and saw Inspector Matthews at his usual post. The man still carried the weight of worry on his shoulders, unaware that help was already being arranged. George whispered a quiet prayer that his plan would work and that Inspector Matthews would soon have reasons to smile again. 3 days had passed since George's conversation with his mother, and the young prince found himself checking his parents' faces for any sign of news about Inspector Matthews. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part of his plan, as he watched the inspector continue his duties while clearly struggling with his personal burden. On Thursday morning, Sir Robert Harrison received the official approval for the new security training position. The paperwork had moved through the palace administration with unusual speed, helped along by Prince William's personal interest in the matter. Sir Robert immediately began preparing for what he anticipated would be a very important conversation with Inspector Matthews. George was in his mathematics lesson when he noticed unusual activity in the main corridor. Through the classroom window, he could see Sir Robert Harrison walking purposefully toward the security office, carrying what appeared to be official documents. The young prince tried to concentrate on his algebra problems, but his mind kept wandering to what might be happening just down the hall. Inspector Matthews was reviewing the day's security schedule when Sir Robert knocked on his office door. The head of security rarely visited individual officers in their workspace, so Inspector Matthews immediately straightened his uniform and invited his superior inside. Sir Robert closed the door behind him and took a seat across from the inspector's desk. The conversation began with Sir Robert praising Inspector Matthews for his years of dedicated service and his expertise in protection work. He mentioned that the palace had been considering ways to improve their training programs for new security personnel and had identified the need for an experienced officer to lead this initiative. Inspector Matthews listened with growing interest as Sir Robert outlined the proposed position. The new role would involve developing training curricula, mentoring junior officers, and sharing best practices throughout the security team. It would be a significant step up in responsibility and recognition within the palace hierarchy. When Sir Robert mentioned the salary that would accompany the new position, Inspector Matthews felt his breath catch in his throat. The increase was substantial, more than enough to cover his mother's medical expenses while still maintaining his current standard of living. For a moment, he wondered if he had heard correctly. Sir Robert explained that Inspector Matthews had been specifically recommended for this role because of his extensive experience and his natural ability to teach and guide others. Several junior officers had already mentioned how much they had learned from working with him, and his reputation for patience and thoroughness made him the ideal candidate. Inspector Matthews asked if he could have some time to consider the offer, though in his heart, he already knew his answer. Sir Robert agreed, suggesting that they meet again the following day to discuss any questions or concerns the inspector might have about the new responsibilities. As Sir Robert left the security office, Inspector Matthews sat alone for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The timing seemed almost miraculous, coming just when he had been preparing to resign from the job he loved to find higher-paying work elsewhere. Meanwhile, George was finishing his lunch when he saw Inspector Matthews walking through the corridor, with a different expression on his face. The heavy weight of worry seemed to have lifted from the man's shoulders, and there was something that looked almost like hope in his eyes. George felt his heart race with anticipation, wondering if his plan was actually working. That afternoon, Inspector Matthews made a phone call to his mother's doctor to discuss her treatment options. For the first time in weeks, he was able to speak about moving forward with the recommended therapy, rather than having to explain why they needed to delay due to financial constraints. The relief in his voice was evident to anyone listening. George spent the afternoon in the palace gardens, the same place where he had first overheard the conversation that started this entire chain of events. He thought about his great-grandmother's teachings about service and responsibility, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he had been able to help someone who had always been there for his family. During the evening briefing, Inspector Matthews shared the news of his job offer with his fellow security officers. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with everyone agreeing that he was the perfect choice for the new training position. Several officers mentioned how much they had learned from him over the years, and how excited they were to have him in a formal teaching role. Word of Inspector Matthews' promotion quickly spread through the palace staff. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, was particularly pleased when she heard the news. She had been genuinely worried about losing such a dedicated member of their palace family, and was delighted that he would be staying and taking on new responsibilities. That evening, Prince William and Catherine discussed the day's events during their private dinner. They were both pleased that the security training position had been offered to Inspector Matthews, and that he seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity. George joined them for dessert, and though he said little about the inspector's news, his parents could see the quiet satisfaction in his eyes. Before bed, George wrote in his private journal about the day's events. He was careful not to reveal too much detail about his own involvement, but he recorded his thoughts about how good it felt to see Inspector Matthews looking hopeful again. He wrote about learning that sometimes the best way to help someone was to find a solution that honored their dignity while meeting their needs. As George prepared for sleep, he looked out his window one last time and saw Inspector Matthews at his evening post. The man was standing straighter, and even from a distance, George could sense a renewed energy in his posture. Tomorrow would bring Inspector Matthews' official acceptance of the new position, and with it, the end of his financial worries and the beginning of an exciting new chapter in his career. Friday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of Kensington Palace, and there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere throughout the building. Inspector Matthews had arrived early for his shift, walking with a spring in his step that hadn't been there for weeks. He carried with him a signed acceptance letter for his new position as head of security training. George was having breakfast with his siblings when Inspector Matthews knocked on the doorframe of the dining room. This was unusual, as security personnel typically maintained their posts rather than seeking out family members directly. Prince William looked up in surprise and invited the inspector to enter. Inspector Matthews approached the table with formal bearing but with genuine emotion visible in his eyes. He thanked Prince William and Catherine for the opportunity to serve in the new training position, explaining how much the role meant to him both professionally and personally. His voice carried a depth of gratitude that made it clear this was more than just a career advancement. George watched quietly as Inspector Matthews spoke about his excitement for developing new training programs and his commitment to ensuring that future security officers would be prepared to protect the royal family with the same dedication he had shown for 15 years. The inspector's passion for his work was evident in every word he spoke. What happened next surprised everyone in the room. Inspector Matthews turned specifically to George and thanked him for always being such a polite and thoughtful young man to work with. He mentioned that protecting George and his siblings had been one of the greatest privileges of his career, and he looked forward to continuing that protection while also training the next generation of guards. George felt his cheeks warm as he quietly thanked Inspector Matthews for his years of service. The exchange was brief but meaningful, and George could see in the inspector's eyes a renewed sense of purpose and hope for the future. Prince William and Catherine exchanged glances, both sensing there was more to this story than they fully understood. After Inspector Matthews left to begin his regular duties, George excused himself from breakfast and made his way to the palace library. It was his favorite place to think, surrounded by books that had been collected by generations of his family. He found a quiet corner near the window and reflected on what he had just witnessed. The plan had worked even better than George had dared to hope. Inspector Matthews had not only received the financial help he needed, but he had also been given new purpose and recognition for his expertise. The inspector's gratitude was genuine, and his excitement about the training role was clearly authentic rather than simply polite acceptance. Later that morning, George encountered Mrs. Patterson in the corridor near the housekeeping offices. The head housekeeper's face was bright with happiness as she shared the news about Inspector Matthews's promotion. She mentioned that the entire staff was celebrating the fact that such a dedicated employee would be staying with the royal household and taking on increased responsibilities. Mrs. Patterson also shared something that touched George deeply. She explained that Inspector Matthews had called his mother the previous evening to tell her about his promotion and to assure her that they could now afford the best possible medical care. The relief and joy in both their voices had been unmistakable during the conversation. George spent his afternoon tutoring session working on a history lesson about Queen Victoria's approach to social responsibility. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, was discussing how the royal family had always played a role in supporting their subjects during difficult times. George listened with particular attention, understanding now in a personal way what it meant to use position and influence to help others. During a break in his lessons, George walked through the corridors and observed the various staff members going about their duties. There was something different in the atmosphere, a sense of satisfaction and community that seemed to have strengthened with the news of Inspector Matthews's promotion. George realized that helping one person had actually benefited the entire palace family. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the palace. Inspector Matthews' colleague from his previous assignment had come to congratulate him on his promotion. The two men spoke in the security office about the new training position, and George could hear their animated conversation through the partially open door as he passed by with his tutor. The visiting colleague mentioned how rare it was to see someone receive such recognition and advancement within the palace system. He praised Inspector Matthews for earning such an honor and asked about his plans for the new training program. George paused to listen as Inspector Matthews outlined his vision for improving security protocols and mentoring new officers. During dinner that evening, the conversation naturally turned to the day's events and Inspector Matthews' promotion. Prince William mentioned how pleased he was that such an experienced and dedicated officer would be leading the new training initiative. Catherine added that she had noticed a positive change in the inspector's demeanor and was happy to see him looking so optimistic about the future. George contributed to the conversation by asking thoughtful questions about how the training program might work and what qualities would be most important for new security officers to develop. His parents were impressed by his genuine interest in the palace operations and his understanding of the importance of the security team's work. As the family finished their meal, George felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the events of the past week. He had identified a problem, developed a solution that respected everyone's dignity, and successfully implemented his plan through the proper channels. Most importantly, he had helped someone who had always been there for his family during their time of need. That night, as George prepared for bed, he looked out his window and saw Inspector Matthews making his evening rounds. The man's posture was confident and purposeful, and there was an energy in his movement that spoke of renewed hope and determination. George smiled quietly, knowing that sometimes the most powerful actions were the ones taken in silence with careful thought and genuine compassion. 2 weeks had passed since Inspector Matthews accepted his new position, and the changes throughout Kensington Palace were remarkable. The inspector had thrown himself into his new role with enthusiasm, developing comprehensive training materials and beginning to work with the first group of junior security officers. His expertise and natural teaching ability were already making a significant impact on the team's capabilities. George had been quietly observing these developments with great satisfaction. During his daily walks through the palace, he could see Inspector Matthews in the training room, patiently explaining security protocols to new recruits. The inspector's confidence had grown noticeably, and his passion for sharing his knowledge was evident in every training session. On this particular Monday morning, something unexpected happened that would reveal George's role in recent events. Mrs. Patterson was delivering fresh linens to the family quarters when she overheard a phone conversation between Catherine and her private secretary. They were discussing various charitable initiatives, and Catherine mentioned how impressed she had been with George's thoughtful proposal regarding Inspector Matthews. Mrs. Patterson paused in her work, suddenly understanding the connection between George's earlier questions about the inspector and the subsequent job promotion. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in her mind, and she realized that the young prince had orchestrated the entire solution. Her respect for George, already considerable, grew exponentially as she understood what he had accomplished. Later that morning, Mrs. Patterson found George in the library during his study period. She approached him carefully, not wanting to embarrass him or make him uncomfortable about his actions. Instead, she simply thanked him for being such a caring and thoughtful member of the royal family. Her words were carefully chosen, but George understood that she knew about his involvement in Inspector Matthews's situation. George looked up from his book and met Mrs. Patterson's eyes with quiet dignity. He neither confirmed nor denied his role in recent events, but simply said that he was glad to see Inspector Matthews looking so happy in his new position. The brief exchange spoke volumes about both the young prince's character and the head housekeeper's wisdom in recognizing it. That afternoon brought an incident that would test everything Inspector Matthews had learned in his years of service and showcase his new role in an unexpected way. A minor security breach occurred when an unauthorized photographer managed to get close to the palace grounds during a shift change. The situation required immediate response and coordination among multiple security personnel. Inspector Matthews took charge of the situation with calm authority, directing the response while simultaneously using the incident as a teaching moment for the junior officers under his supervision. He explained each decision as he made it, helping the new recruits understand the reasoning behind different security protocols and the importance of maintaining vigilance at all times. George witnessed the incident from his classroom window and was struck by Inspector Matthews' composure and leadership during the emergency. The inspector's new role had given him additional authority and confidence, and he was clearly thriving in his expanded responsibilities. The photographer was quickly and professionally removed from the premises, without any disruption to the royal family's schedule. Following the incident, Sir Robert Harrison commended Inspector Matthews for his excellent handling of the situation and his effective use of it as a training opportunity. The head of security noted that the new training program was already paying dividends in terms of improved coordination and response among the security team. That evening, Inspector Matthews received another piece of good news that made his week complete. His mother's doctor called to report that her latest tests showed significant improvement in her condition. The new treatment plan, which they had been able to afford thanks to his promotion, was working better than anyone had dared to hope. Inspector Matthews immediately called his mother to share the wonderful news with her. Their conversation was filled with tears of joy and relief, as both realized that the worst of their worries were finally behind them. The inspector's mother expressed her gratitude for the royal family's recognition of her son's dedication and the opportunity they had given him to advance in his career. During dinner, George listened as his parents discussed the day's security incident and praised Inspector Matthews's professional handling of the situation. Prince William mentioned that the inspector seemed to have found his true calling in the training role, combining his practical experience with a natural ability to teach and mentor others. Catherine added that she had received positive feedback from several members of the security team about the new training program. The junior officers were learning more quickly and effectively under Inspector Matthews's guidance, and the overall morale of the security department had improved significantly since the program began. George contributed to the conversation by observing that Inspector Matthews seemed much happier lately, and that his positive attitude appeared to be affecting everyone around him. His parents agreed, noting that the inspector's renewed energy and enthusiasm had created a ripple effect throughout the palace staff. Later that evening, George was walking through the corridor when he encountered Inspector Matthews finishing his shift. The inspector stopped to speak with the young prince, expressing his gratitude for the kindness and respect that the royal family had always shown him. He mentioned how much he was enjoying his new, responsibilities, and how fulfilling it was to share his knowledge with the next generation of security officers. George listened politely and thanked Inspector Matthews for his continued dedication to protecting the family. Their conversation was brief but warm, and George could see in the inspector's eyes a contentment and purpose that had been missing just a few weeks earlier. The transformation was complete, and everyone involved had benefited from the outcome. As George prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the lessons he had learned throughout this experience. He had discovered that true leadership often meant working behind the scenes to create positive change. He had learned that the most effective help was often the kind that preserved people's dignity while meeting their needs. Most importantly, he had understood that even small actions, when thoughtfully planned and carefully executed, could have profound and lasting impacts on people's lives. 6 months had passed since Inspector Matthews began his new role as head of security training, and the impact of that quiet morning when George first overheard the conversation had rippled far beyond anyone's initial expectations. The training program had become a model for other royal residences, and Inspector Matthews had been invited to share his methods with security teams throughout the royal household system. On this sunny spring morning, George was walking through the same garden path where he had first contemplated how to help Inspector Matthews. The young prince had grown taller and carried himself with increased confidence, though he maintained the same thoughtful demeanor that had always characterized his approach to life. As he walked, George reflected on how much had changed since that worried conversation between security officers. Inspector Matthews was now not only financially secure but had also gained recognition as an expert in his field. His mother had made a full recovery and often visited the palace to meet the colleagues who spoke so highly of her son. The success of the training program had led to additional opportunities for Inspector Matthews. He had been asked to write a manual on royal protection protocols and had even been invited to speak at security conferences. His expertise, which had always been valued within the palace, was now being recognized across the entire security industry. George paused near the rose garden, the same spot where he had made his decision to act all those months ago. He thought about the conversation he had overheard the previous week, when Inspector Matthews was speaking with a new recruit about the importance of observation and patience in security work. The inspector had mentioned that sometimes the smallest details could make the biggest difference in protecting the people under their care. The irony was not lost on George that Inspector Matthews had unknowingly described the very approach the young prince had taken to help him. George had observed carefully, acted patiently, and paid attention to details that others might have missed. The result had been a solution that honored everyone's dignity while addressing a serious need. That afternoon brought a special ceremony that would mark the formal recognition of Inspector Matthews' contributions to royal security. The event was being held in the palace's main reception room, with members of the royal family, senior staff, and security personnel in attendance. George had specifically requested permission to be present for the ceremony. Prince William began the ceremony by speaking about the importance of excellence in service and the value of experience and dedication. He praised Inspector Matthews for his 15 years of loyal service and his innovative approach to training the next generation of security officers. The inspector stood at attention, his pride evident but controlled in the professional manner that had always defined his character. Catherine then presented Inspector Matthews with a formal commendation recognizing his contributions to royal security and his leadership in developing the new training program. She spoke about how his work had not only improved security protocols, but had also strengthened the sense of teamwork and mutual support throughout the palace staff. When Inspector Matthews was invited to speak, he expressed his deep gratitude for the opportunity to serve the royal family and for the trust they had placed in him to lead the training initiative. He spoke about his love for his work and his commitment to ensuring that future security officers would be prepared to protect the royal family with the same dedication he had always tried to demonstrate. As Inspector Matthews concluded his remarks, he made an unexpected observation that brought tears to many eyes in the room. He mentioned that working for the royal family had taught him that true nobility was not about titles or ceremonies, but about caring for others and using whatever influence you had to make a positive difference in people's lives. George felt his heart swell with emotion as he listened to these words, understanding that Inspector Matthews was describing exactly what the young prince had tried to do all those months ago. The inspector continued by saying that he had learned this lesson, not just from the senior members of the royal family, but from observing the character and compassion of all family members, regardless of their age. Following the ceremony, there was a reception where George had the opportunity to speak privately with Inspector Matthews. The inspector thanked George for always treating him with respect and kindness, mentioning that the young prince's thoughtful questions and genuine interest in his work had meant more to him than George might realize. George simply replied that Inspector Matthews had always made him feel safe and protected, and that he was glad to see the inspector looking so happy and fulfilled in his new role. Their conversation was brief but meaningful, representing the quiet acknowledgement between two people who understood the importance of loyalty and mutual care. As the reception continued, George noticed his parents watching him with expressions of pride and admiration. Though they had never explicitly discussed his role in Inspector Matthews' promotion, George sensed that they understood more about his involvement than they had initially let on. Their approval meant everything to him, confirming that he had acted in accordance with the values they had taught him. Later that evening, George sat in his room writing in his journal about the day's events and the lessons he had learned throughout this experience. He wrote about discovering that real power came not from commanding others but from finding ways to help them succeed and thrive. He reflected on learning that the best solutions were often those that created benefits for everyone involved. As he finished writing, George looked out his window and saw Inspector Matthews making his evening rounds. The man moved with confidence and purpose, secure in his position and proud of his work. The inspector paused beneath George's window and looked up, offering a small salute that the young prince returned with a smile. George understood that this gesture represented more than just the formal relationship between a royal family member and a security officer. It was an acknowledgement of mutual respect, shared values, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful actions were those taken without fanfare or recognition. That night, as George prepared for sleep, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the path he had chosen and the outcome it had produced. He had learned that leadership was not about making grand gestures or seeking praise, but about identifying needs and finding thoughtful ways to address them. Most importantly, he had discovered that acting with compassion and wisdom, even at a young age, could create positive changes that would last far beyond the immediate moment. The young prince fell asleep knowing that Inspector Matthews would sleep peacefully too, free from financial worry and fulfilled in meaningful work, and that sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that remained forever unspoken.